When it comes to behavior, there's usually one of two things that a child is aiming for. Usually because they want something or they want to get out of doing something. Hey everybody, I'm Ash the OT, and welcome to my channel where I provide parents and caregivers tools and strategies in order to help the little ones in your life to learn, grow, and make progress. So today we are talking all about sensory versus behavior. Now, if you have not checked out the other two previous videos in my sensory series, make sure you do that as well, because I dive a little bit deeper into sensory processing disorder, as well as what are the 8 hidden senses that may be affecting our child. But getting back to today's video, we are going to be talking about a subject that is very, very cloudy sometimes, as sensory versus behavior is not always so cut and crystal clear. So let's first break down what is sensory and what is behavior. So just to give you a brief definition, sensory or sensory integration is basically the ability of our brains to process and interpret all of the information that's coming in from our 8 senses and making sense of it, or making it available for us to interpret correctly so that we can respond in a more appropriate and functional way in our daily lives and in our environment. So when a child is not able to process all of this information correctly that's coming into their bodies and being processed by their brains, that is what is known as a sensory processing disorder or dysfunction, or maybe just a sensory processing challenge. So when we talk about behavior, most people hear the word behavior and they automatically think bad or negative things or acting up or acting out. But that is not the definition of behavior. Behavior is something that we all do, because behavior is simply a strategy that we all try to implement in order to help us deal with a situation or in order to help us get our needs met. So children who have sensory processing issues are often mislabeled and misunderstood because they may in fact be showing and demonstrating some behaviors that are negative or behaviors that are not so appropriate for the environment that they're in. And people may misunderstand that and say, oh, that child's just being bad or that child's acting up, when in reality, that child may truly have an underlying sensory issue or a sensory need that needs to get met. So let me give you some examples, because I love to give examples to make things clear, right? So let's say you have a child and they have to do an art project for school. So I'm gonna talk about 3 different types of children, right? Let's say there's child A. Child A gets her project and child A has to work with markers, crayons, glue, finger paint, construction paper, and scissors. And the child does all the steps, they follow all the directions, they complete their project, their hands get messy, they're fine, they clean up, their project is done, they move on about their day. Then we have child number 2, or child B. Then we have child B, and child B does the project, but they're a little bit more hesitant to get their hands messy. They still do it, but it's not their favorite. But they still hold it together, even though occasionally they may make a few faces when they have to touch the glue or get their hands wet in the finger paint. It's not their favorite, but they still get through it. They still keep it together. Then we have child C. And when child C starts to interact with the project, they get their hands dirty and get their hands messy by playing with the finger paint and glue, but they have a complete meltdown, which results in them crying, screaming, hitting at others, hitting at their teachers, running away, and hiding. So from an outsider looking in who just happens to see that moment, that child is acting up or being bad. But from a sensory standpoint, maybe that touch of the finger paint and glue was very, very aversive to them, and something in their systems is not processing it correctly. So they interpret that sensation as something that's being dangerous or as even being painful. So that is where that fine line between sensory and behavior can be so hard to tear apart at times. So let's dive a little bit more into what some other examples may look like for a child who truly does have sensory issues, but may be exhibiting some negative behaviors or some inappropriate behaviors for the environment that they're in or the situation that they're in. So if there is a child who is exhibiting some sensory sensitivity challenges, they may also be having some avoidance behaviors. So a child who is sensitive to certain sensory input may result in things such as running away, hiding, trying to get out of the situation, not wanting to come into the same room where the situation is taking place. Those are all behaviors that are contributed to them being sensitive or trying to avoid the sensory input that they perceive as being dangerous to them. Then we have our sensory seeking children, and some of their behaviors may look like bouncing off the walls, not being able to sit still. They are constantly touching other people. They are constantly bumping into things. They are constantly putting things in their mouth. They can't stand still in line, or when they are in line, they're always touching other people in front or behind them. Those are some behaviors that are contributed more to kids who have sensory seeking challenges. Then we have our kiddos who have poor or low registration. And basically that means they have decreased awareness with all the sensory input that is coming from the outside in, or even internally. So they're not registering sensory input at the level that they should. And so that may lead to behaviors that look like they may be ignoring you, or it may look like they're just uninterested in all the activities or anything that you present them with. So let's use the grocery store example. Let's say you bring your child into a grocery store, and you know the grocery store is full of sensory input, right? They have bright lights. Sometimes there's a lot of noise. Sometimes there's a lot of people. It can be crowded. It can have a lot of different smells to it. So there's just an overwhelming amount of sensory input that your child has to process and make sense of it. And if they're not able to do that, that is what is known as sensory overload. And to them, it may just result in a meltdown. So you may have to remove your child from that situation in order to help them to regulate or calm down in that situation. But let's transition into behavior. Let's use the same example of the grocery store. Bring your child into the grocery store and they ask for a piece of candy. You tell them no, and what happens? They completely lose it, right? They start crying and yelling and screaming and maybe even throwing things. That is more of a tantrum versus a meltdown. And that is what is known as more of a negative behavior, because they wanted something and you told them no, and the result was, okay, then I'm gonna scream and act up until I get my way. So when it comes to behavior, there's usually one of two things that a child is aiming for. It's usually because they want something or they want to get out of doing something. So another way to know that a child is exhibiting more of a behavioral issue versus a sensory issue is if that child is engaging in this negative behavior while looking directly at you, because they want that feedback. They want to get a rise or a reaction out of you. So they're looking directly at you. That's how you know that this is probably more of a behavioral incident. Or a child could also be laughing or giggling during a situation when they know it's not right, or something that you told them not to do and they do it anyway. They're looking at you, they're laughing, and they're giggling because, yet again, they want a reaction out of you. Those are more behavioral incidents than a sensory incident. Also, it's important to be mindful that a lot of kids act up because they are seeking attention, right? And this is not to judge anybody at all, but it's so easy for individuals or parents or caregivers to give a lot of attention to kids when they are acting up, right? So oftentimes parents may say no, or don't do this, or stop doing that. And that's when children get a lot of attention. So some kids, they understand that. So they're like, okay, in order to get mom's attention or dad's attention, I have to do something bad or do something to make them upset, because that's when they pay attention the most. So to counteract that, what you all have to do as parents is to catch them being good, right? So every time you notice them doing something that is a preferred behavior, let them know about it, right? So if they're sitting down quietly, tell them. If they are playing nicely with other people, tell them. If they're sharing, tell them. Whatever it is, constantly point out the positive behaviors that they are doing, so that way in the future, those are the behaviors that they learn that get them more attention than the negative behaviors that they perceive to give them that attention. So whether your child has sensory issues that are causing some behaviors, or whether your child is exhibiting negative behaviors because they're trying to get something or avoid something, there are strategies for both situations. So let's start with the sensory strategy. So I'll just give you a few. If you have a child that is having some behaviors because of a sensory issue, then first of all, step number one is you have to figure out what is the underlying sensory issue. Is your child seeking something? Is your child trying to avoid something? And if so, what are some sensory strategies that you can do to kind of help them conquer those things, right? Another thing that you can do is always have some type of cool down spot, safe spot, or even comfort item for a kid that has a sensory processing challenge. They need something that's familiar to them and something that provides them comfort, or something that provides them a way to get to a safe space in case they are feeling a bit overloaded or overwhelmed with sensory input. Also, you want to allow a child who has sensory processing challenges to have gradual, slow, and natural learning about the situation. So for example, if a child is very aversive to certain textures, you never want to force a child to do anything that is aversive to them. So if they don't want to touch something, do not grab their hand and force them to do it, right? Because that's just going to take them 10 steps back and make it that much harder for them to overcome whatever it is that they're needing to overcome. And if all else fails, make sure you consult with an occupational therapist who can evaluate your child more precisely in order to help you determine what their sensory challenges may in fact be. So for behavioral strategies, tip number one is to define the behavior. You need to know what it is that either your child is trying to get or what it is that they are trying to avoid, so that you can monitor their behavior and have the appropriate response to it. Also, if your child is showing more of a negative behavioral response to something because they are seeking attention or they are acting out, make sure you do not have a parent tantrum, right? If your kid's yelling and screaming and crying, you don't want to yell and raise your voice and lose yourself too in the process. You need to be the parent, you need to be firm, you need to be consistent, and you need to be in control over the situation. Also, don't just tell your kids don't or no or stop without giving them an alternative to what they should be doing. So instead of saying don't do this, you can say something like it's time to do this, right? Or instead of saying stop, you can say let's make a better choice. So it's all about the language that you're using as well. Also, be consistent with your threats, right? So if you say no, then mean it. You cannot backtrack, say no, and then turn around and give in and say yes. Because your child is just gonna learn that, okay, mom said no, but all I have to do is act up a little bit and she's gonna give in. And next time, if she doesn't give in right away, I'm just gonna act up and act louder and do worse things until I get my way, until she eventually gives in. And kids learn and they pick up on that so quick. So make sure, parents, if you're saying no, mean it and be firm and be consistent about it. And as I mentioned before, definitely catch them being good. So this video is meant to simply just kind of give you some guidance in deciphering sensory related issues versus negative behaviors versus behaviors that in fact do have underlying sensory issues. But if you're still unclear and if you still need help, definitely consult with an occupational therapist who can break down a little bit more of the sensory processing and really evaluate your particular child to see what may be going on. You can talk to your pediatrician and they can also help guide you as well. There are also different therapists out there who do help children that have, in fact, behavioral issues such as oppositional defiant disorder. So definitely get the help and seek the help that you need. You are the parent. You have to be your child's biggest advocate. So I hope this all was helpful. And once again, guys, definitely check out part 1 and part 2 of my sensory series. And also, I do have a free checklist in the description below of some sensory red flags. So it's a list of behaviors that your child may be exhibiting, but they are in fact sensory processing challenges, not just flat out negative behaviors. So I hope you found this video helpful, and I will see you guys on the next one. Bye.